So, first question, I've had a lot of people on this podcast who were liberals who got kind of mugged by the progressive left. But your story is very different. You got mugged by the Fox News right. I mean, you deal with it kind of glancingly in your book, which, like, for a lot of people, it would be like four chapters of, how I got completely misrepresented in the media. But that section of your book actually left me interested in more detail. Can you tell us a little bit about this?
Sure. So back in 2014, I guess it was about 10 years now. Um, I had most of my work that I had been doing was at that time on foreign policy and Middle East politics, um, because I had started when I started my academic career. I wanted to be a philosopher, and I had a twin brother who was killed in Afghanistan. Um, and in the aftermath of that, I kind of switched my focus to from focusing on things like metaphysics, which is like what is the structure and nature of reality, questions about like what is the meaning of life, to focus more on um, applied social epistemology. So like what do we know in virtue of what, with a particular focus on kind of national security, foreign policy questions, with the hope of trying to help other families avoid the kind of tragedy that my own family was working through. Um, and so I was working a lot on Middle East politics, international affairs. I was teaching um, at the University of Arizona as an adjunct in the political science department, where I would teach classes on national security policy and international organizations, things like this. And I helped manage an academic consortium that brought together um, veterans who were students and students from war affected regions to study Middle East conflict together. Um, and so over the course of while I was doing all of that, in addition to my kind of nerdy academic work, I was also doing public writing. My public writing then was a lot different than it is today. At some point in 2014, I published an article in the journal Middle East Policy. It was very exciting. It's like the number one cited journal at that time for contemporary Middle East affairs. Um, but then there's this kind of cottage industry that was really popular at that time, less so today. But 2014 ISIS was still like a very
Sure.
pronounced. Um, if you were someone who is from the Middle East or someone who used to be a Muslim but isn't anymore, there was a kind of cottage industry at that time where you could kind of go on right leaning media and be like, Muslims are horrible, I would know, kind of thing. Um, and so someone who is affiliated with that with that industry at that time read my article, didn't like it, and decided to try to troll me on Twitter about it. And I don't engage this way anymore, but at the time, I basically kind of destroyed this guy as it became clear that he was ignorant on the substance of the like empirical questions of like what was actually happening in Syria, where are things going, what are the statistics, and as it became clear he didn't know much about that. He tried to shift the conversation to things like principles about liberty and justice. And I was like, great, I'm a philosopher. Let's do that. Really
Okay.
just kind of twisted the knife, engaged in a way that was
Yeah.
not in a way that I engage today. At the time, I was a columnist for Al Jazeera America, but he was a regular contributor to Fox News, which is to
I
say he
I
had
see
a
where this is going. I see where this is going.
he had a much bigger platform
Right.
than I did, and so he responded to me kind of spiking the ball in this way by trying to launch a smear campaign to get me fired from the University of Arizona. It started in kind of smaller right-leaning outlets like the Washington Free Beacon, but then got picked up by Fox News. And so on Election Day 2014, it came out that the Republicans had won the Senate, at which time that became the news. I was the news. I was what they used to help fill the airtime. If you went to foxnews.com, the first thing you would have seen is my face. They talked about me on air a couple of times, and it was kind of a disaster for every department and institution I was affiliated with at the University of Arizona, which got flooded with death threats and hate mail, and there were
Oh my God.
reporters who were trying to crash my classes to catch me in the act of corrupting the youth and all of this kind of stuff.
just to be clear, like, did they expect they were going to catch you on camera, like recruiting for ISIS or something? I mean, some of these things are so hyperbolic.
Yeah.
And I mean, look, to be fair, um, I mean, there are people, you're not one of them, but there are people who present as like kind of respectable intellectual academics, and often do have some very unsettling ideological commitments, including in the area of Islamism. Certainly, like in France and stuff, there's been a few academics who live kind of double lives in that respect and use deliberately vague language. So, like some of these culture warriors come by it honestly, but they also like sometimes just choose the wrong targets. And in your case, maybe I'm guessing they just teed off on the name, and like
Well, and what they did, the people who were launching this smear campaign, is they took bits and pieces of things that I wrote in different outlets, took them way out of context. And if you just think, oh, this is a trustworthy person, this outlet who's launching the smear campaign
yeah,
is trustworthy, and they aren't willfully taking bits and pieces out of context and distorting them to portray the opposite of what the author. If you don't start by assuming that kind of bad faith, then I could see how you could read their articles and go, well, what's up with this guy? But the reality is, again, I'm from a military family and a military community, and the only reason I was doing any of this work is because I personally know loss from war. I'm not some kind of anti-American radical leftist or whatever. I never have been. And here's one way that my work changed a lot after this: is so in the short term, this was like, again, it was a disaster for me. It was a disaster for the departments and institutions I was affiliated with. It was really terrible. I felt a lot of guilt, and I realized two things. I realized one of the problems is that people like me don't really engage with the kind of audience like Fox News's typical audience much at all. And when we do, it's typically in this sneering, mocking kind of
right,
adversarial way. Um, and I hadn't, before this, I hadn't even tried to ever write for right leaning media because I had just assumed, well, I'm a black Muslim intellectual. Who would want to hear what I have to say? Oh, probably someone on the left. So I didn't even bother trying to write for right leaning outlets. But I responded to getting attacked by Fox News by trying to engage more with
right,
people across the aisle. And so I started taking the same essays that I would normally publish somewhere like Al Jazeera. And I didn't change anything about the arguments, which is to say, I didn't refrain from saying anything that I would say in Al Jazeera. I didn't say anything that I didn't believe, but it just changed the framing and stuff to speak to other people's
yeah,
values, concerns, and maps of meaning and stuff. And not only were right leaning outlets willing to publish my work, um, but I found that, and people on the right were excited to actually engage, to be able to talk to a black Muslim intellectual who wasn't in their space, to say, to like villainize them or demean them or
sure,
whatever. And in the process of kind of thinking through how would I make this same argument to people who didn't already share X set of priors and beliefs, I started to recognize sort of blind spots and limitations in how I was thinking about a lot of issues too, like trying to write the same article for that I would normally write for Al Jazeera, but for the American Conservative instead,
yeah,
forced me to like really think about the issue in a different way. And I started to realize actually both that exercise and also engaging with the readers in right leaning media, um, responding to their questions and emails and concerns and stuff like this. Actually deepened my own understanding of things a lot, and it completely changed my understanding. And it actually led me to reevaluate the work that I was previously doing for outlets like Al Jazeera and whatever. For instance, I came to realize that a lot of the work that I was doing before um, wasn't particularly valuable. So, for instance, if the US is considering bombing Syria, it doesn't do a lot of good to go write in an outlet like Al Jazeera, don't bomb Syria. Here's why. what you need to do if you actually want to make any movement on preventing that eventuality is go to the people who actually do think it's a good idea to bomb Syria and talk to them about
sure.
why it's not in a way that they find compelling and accessible and things like this. Try to persuade those people. If you're just cheerleading with people who already agree with you, there's you're not really doing much.
So it's really interesting what you're saying because, as some of my regular listeners know, for a brief period, about 2 years, I was editor of a left wing magazine here in Canada. And one of the first things I did there is I actually didn't change the editorial policy that much. Like, we still had a lot of highly progressive writers. One thing I did do is I'd look at drafts and I'd say, I don't necessarily agree with this argument, but let's publish it. But what I want you to do is change the language so that it at least appears like you're making a good faith effort to argue with people who don't agree with you. Because right now there's a lot of coded language, which essentially means everyone believes X. Here's a kind of formulaic recitation of the arguments in favor of X to prove that I'm a fervent believer in X, the end.
Yeah.
And I said, get rid of the jargon, because there's a lot of jargon there that's intentionally opaque, because it's not the fact that most people don't understand it is a feature, not a bug, because
Yes.
it shows you're part of the shamanistic class that agrees with that stuff and understands it. And I said, look, I want you to write in the language of actual good faith persuasion.